They didn't fear the barbarians at the gate. They didn't lose sleep over the cavalry charging across the open plains. What truly terrified the commanders of Rome, the men who held the fate of empires in their hands, was something far simpler, far more invisible, and far more deadly. It was the moment a soldier reached into his ration sack and found nothing. Because an army without food isn't an army anymore. It's a mob. And Rome had learned that lesson the hard way, written in the bones of legions that marched too far, too fast, and too hungry. What they built to prevent that silence, that empty, echoing silence of an empty stomach, was something the world had never seen before. Picture this. 100,000 soldiers on the move. Not marching in a neat Hollywood column, but stretching across the land like a slow-moving city. Tents, animals, wagons, officers, surgeons, engineers, accountants, and cooks. All of them hungry. All of them burning through energy, with every kilometer of rough terrain. At their pace, that human city consumed close to 100 tons of grain in a single day. Not a week. Not a month. One day. That number alone should stop you cold. Because the Romans didn't have freight trucks or refrigerated containers or GPS-tracked supply chains. They had mules, river barges, stone roads, and the most ruthless bureaucratic precision the ancient world had ever produced. The foundation of every Roman soldier's existence was wheat. Not meat, not wine, not olive oil, wheat. Each legionnaire needed roughly a kilogram of grain daily just to function, just to march, just to lift a shield and stand in formation without his legs giving way beneath him. Roman commanders hadn't read modern sports science, but they had done something more powerful. They had watched. They had observed what happened when soldiers ate too much meat on long campaigns. The men tired faster. Their stamina collapsed. Their bodies burned hot and faded quickly. But soldiers fed on grain, on slow-burning, complex carbohydrates. They could march all day. They could dig fortifications at dusk. They could wake before dawn and do it all over again. What modern nutritionists call carb loading, the Romans called survival. They didn't arrive at it through theory. They arrived at it through thousands of dead men. Here is where it gets fascinating. The Romans didn't hand their soldiers baked bread. They didn't ship loaves from central kitchens or distribute flatbreads from some vast imperial bakery. They issued raw grain, hard, dry, unprocessed kernels that could survive weeks of travel without rotting. Every evening, after a full day's march, 8 soldiers would sit together around their assigned millstone and grind that grain by hand. The work was slow, grinding, and exhausting. But it was also ingenious. Dry grain stored for years. Ground flour spoiled in days. By pushing the final step of food preparation onto the soldiers themselves, the Romans solved one of the oldest problems in logistics, spoilage, without inventing a single new technology. They simply changed who did the work and when. What modern trainers might call a functional workout, the Roman army called dinner preparation. From that freshly ground flour, soldiers made unleavened flatbread cooked directly over the campfire, or a thick, dense porridge called pulse, seasoned with salt and a thin ribbon of olive oil. It tasted, by most accounts, like warm paste, but it was calorie-dense, fast to prepare, and it kept men on their feet. The Romans were not chasing flavor. They were chasing endurance. And alongside that grain came pasca, a mixture of water and sour wine that served as their daily drink. Modern researchers have noted that the acidity of that mixture acted as a natural disinfectant, killing waterborne bacteria that could otherwise tear through a camp in days. The Romans didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that soldiers who drank pasca stayed healthy longer. In warfare, that knowledge was worth more than any sword. Now imagine the machinery required to move 100 tons of grain every single day. Not through modern logistics parks with forklift operators and automated inventory systems, but across muddy roads, mountain passes, flooded river crossings, and enemy territory. The Roman answer was the mule. Not the horse, which was too expensive, too fragile, and too hungry. The mule, stubborn, powerful, low maintenance, became the single most important piece of military equipment in the Roman army. For every 10 soldiers, there was at least one loaded pack mule carrying up to 100 kilograms across 30 kilometers of difficult terrain, without complaint. The caravans stretched for kilometers behind the marching columns, a river of hooves and leather, grain and tools, millstones and tent poles. Losing a mule was treated as losing state property, because it was. Without those animals, the legions couldn't move, couldn't eat, and couldn't survive. But the Romans understood something deeper than just moving food from one point to another. They understood time. A marching army operates within a window, a precise, mathematical window of days before the food runs out and discipline begins to dissolve. Roman quartermasters calculated that window with obsessive accuracy. They knew exactly how many days a column could advance before it needed to reach the next supply depot. And so they built those depots, massive stone granaries positioned at strategic intervals across the empire, each one ventilated and elevated to prevent moisture and rats, each one capable of storing grain for up to 2 years. An army on campaign didn't carry its entire food supply on its back. It moved from depot to depot like a chain, each link feeding the next. It was, in every meaningful sense, a just-in-time delivery system, invented 2,000 years before the concept had a name. The rivers and seas carried what the roads could not. Land transport was slow and costly. An ox cart consumed part of its own cargo in the fodder required to pull it across 100 kilometers. But a flat-bottomed river barge, guided by the current of the Rhine or the Danube, could move thousands of kilograms of grain at almost no cost at all. Roman river fleets patrolled those waterways around the clock, armed against barbarian raids, protecting the floating arteries that fed the border legions. And when the weather allowed, the Mediterranean sea lanes carried even greater volumes, entire fleets of grain ships moving between Egypt, North Africa, and the ports of the empire. When pirates threatened those routes, Rome didn't send diplomats. It sent warships. A clear sea lane was a national security priority. Every grain convoy that reached port safely was another few weeks of legions that could hold the frontier. When the system worked, it was invisible like all great infrastructure. But when it broke, the consequences were catastrophic and fast. A storm could sink a grain fleet. A wildfire could reduce a warehouse to ash. An ambush could scatter a mule caravan in a mountain pass. And in those moments, the army had to survive on what it could take. The Romans called it fermentatio, the organized foraging of the surrounding land. Half the legion would secure the camp while the other half moved outward in tight armed formations, searching farms, barns, and underground caches for anything edible. It was not casual looting. It was methodical, disciplined, and dangerous. Local resistance turned foraging parties into targets. Peasants buried their grain in pits and disguised the hiding places with fresh earth. Roman veterans learned to read the ground, probing suspicious soil with iron spears, hunting for hollow spaces beneath the surface. It was a desperate, ugly game, the invaders hunting for food, the locals hiding it to survive the winter. Neither side had the luxury of mercy. But even fermentatio had limits. An army spending most of its daylight hours searching for food was an army that couldn't fight, couldn't advance, couldn't lay siege. A force stretched across the countryside in foraging parties was a force vulnerable to ambush. And a force eating nothing but captured meat, after months on grain, was a force riddled with digestive illness and low morale. Roman soldiers, remarkably, preferred their plain porridge. Meat was emergency rations. Eating it every day was considered a sign that things had gone badly wrong. Which brings us to the most dangerous enemy the Roman army ever faced. Not the Germanic tribes, not the Parthian cavalry, not the mountain fortresses of Judea. It was hunger. Slow, patient, invisible hunger. When rations dropped, discipline followed. When discipline cracked, what remained was not a legion. It was a collection of armed, angry, starving men. The great killing machine of the ancient world had one fatal vulnerability, and everyone who faced Rome knew exactly where it was. Great empires are not remembered for their granaries. History fills its pages with battles and generals, with conquest and collapse. But behind every Roman victory, behind every campaign that reshaped the ancient world, was a quartermaster in a leather tent, working by lamplight, counting sacks of grain on a wax tablet. There was a mule driver coaxing his animal across a flooded road at midnight. There was a dock worker in Alexandria loading amphorae of oil onto a grain ship before dawn. These men had no monuments. No poets sang their names. But without them, every sword in Rome's arsenal was useless. The legions marched on iron discipline and military genius, but they stood on wheat. And the lesson Rome carved into 2,000 years of history is one that hasn't changed since the first army ever left its homeland. Feed your soldiers, and they are unstoppable. Let them go hungry, and no wall in the world will save you.